Hey y'all, it's Khalil,
Hey, it's Chad.
and we are the Monsters of Truth. So as we move out of the Congress of Vienna, we are now looking at the other side of Metternich, representing the reactionary forces of the liberals and the French revolutionary idealists. So we are looking at the point of view of the liberals, as well as the point of view of those reactionary forces in those leadership positions, and really why there was so much of an emphasis on peacekeeping within Europe against liberals, but also what that meant to the liberals, giving a little bit of a sneak peek for 1848. So as we do that, we need to again keep in mind that the importance of like the coalitions that were that um the the coalitions against France throughout that 25-year long time period from the French Revolutionary Wars to the Napoleonic Wars. Um, they changed tune once peace came around in 1815. They were no longer fighting against France because France, by 1815 was now like a major contributor to European peace. And so they created this new pact between each other called the Holy Alliance, and where all the monarchies, and which was damn near almost all the states in Europe, would join together against revolutionaries. And this was universal. The Holy Alliance was not just amongst major powers like Prussia, Austria, Russia, France, and Britain, even Spain. It was amongst all the monarchies, even the small little states in Germany that seemed like they didn't matter too much. The Holy
Yeah,
Alliance was to make sure that if one little state in Europe caught a sneeze, that Europe didn't catch a cold. So
yeah. It's wild. It's basically the opposite of the end of World War II. With the World War II, I mean, of course, skipping ahead 100 some years in the future. But with the end of World War II, we had the nations all allying together against a common threat in Europe, specifically against Nazi Germany. And as soon as they were over, guns were facing at each other. Um, the division of Europe, we had the Iron Curtain, we had NATO and the Warsaw Pact. But here we have the entirety of Europe, not just France and Britain, but you had Switzerland, you had Italy, all these countries and nations that were starting to form, had formed, and working together to keep everyone and to work together to keep the peace. And again, well, did they do so effectively? Kinda. I mean, they did well, and again, we're going to um, we'll lead up into in the next couple of episodes of the important times of 1848. But we had Europe basically united against an idea, more so for liberalism, in the idea that in what that really brought, which was fear and war, more so war, which is what a lot of these nations were fearing for. And so we had an entire continent for, again, of something that is pretty surprising for Europe that's always constantly at war to be, on somewhat similar terms against an idea that would, for good reason, upend all of their rules and kings and things of the sort. All of that united all for like against that idea.
because people at the time by 1815 saw the danger that came with revolution. They saw what happened when people wanted to revolt for rights. And so regardless of whatever points and whatever arguments the liberals had for there needing to be rights of peoples and why serfdom needed to be abolished and why there needed to be freedom of speech and assembly, the kings and emperors basically decided, no, because if we give you anything, you'll start killing us, you'll start killing us kings, you'll start starting wars against every other nation in Europe, and you'll start trying to unite the world under this sense of unity, which could only happen after centuries of unnecessary war. And
Gee, and I
so
wonder why.
yeah, they did not trust the liberal model to bring peace because they believed that if there was a revolution that erupted against statehood, people would naturally find ways of dividing each other. If people could somehow unite under an idea, and that idea, would be and everybody decided to be part of this world state or even this European state. Because if you, as you remember from our episode, talking about when a thought has no borders, we were looking at a couple quotes from German authors at the time and proclamations of French like German border regions nearby France in the 1790s joining France in their liberal experiment. The idea was that if you had a continued unity of liberal ideals in a world state almost, you know, then there would then because of liberals and nationalist branches that people would naturally find different ways of dividing each other and leading right back to not to nationalism and again other unnecessary war. So there was a reasonable fear of revolution because they thought, why not just stick with the old model, trust in it, maybe make some slight reforms if you can promise that you won't undermine the entire integrity of the state and bring the continent into war. And
Yeah.
so how
Plus,
the current model is being the most stable.
yeah. Plus, throwing the only real example of liberalism that they got at the time, France. What did they do? Start a continental war. So the only thing you could really associate liberalism with on a state level is war. And that's exactly what these leaders are trying to stop. So in the context, liberalism is basically the enemy to be fought. It's the enemy below all these territorial gains, and the idea of the balance of power is that people can't be trusted to form their own nations, to determine themselves what are the ills of society, and to realize the problems that really these kings and these lords and things are imposing upon them. These leaders don't want to trust them to do that because they know they'll just kind of figure out and get killed. So
Yeah.
under all these ideas, under all this balance of power, all these, literally establishing nations from the states, really from the ground up, like the German Confederation, that all of that is really a reaction to liberalism in the fear that people would revolt and rise up against all these feudal kings and create their own countries was terrifying. And so this is what they had to be dealing with the next 20, 30 years.
And this is why, after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, there were continued conferences for the next a good 6 or 7 years after 1815 until Napoleon's death, and where all the kings and emperors and princes and nobles of all these states in Europe, big and small, would come together and they would formulate their policies and they would agree on extradition. They would agree on whether or not a certain states soldiers could be brought over to another state's borders to quash a revolution if that nation's army was insufficient to stop it. And so, like for example, like if Austria were able to, if there was an agreement, let's say between the French aristocracy in 1789 with the Habsburg Austrians, that they would send over an army to Paris in the case of revolution, then the French Revolution might never have ever happened. You know, so there were these agreements post 1815 of how to deal with rebels. And so Tsar Alexander, the leader of Russia, who was such a threat, you know, during the Congress of Vienna, he was speaking to a British observer during one of these conferences in October of 1820, saying, quote, all our facilities should be directed to counteract and oppose that fatal spirit which was making such rapid progress in Europe, and to settle upon some principle of common action and conduct with regard to it, so that military revolution and machinations of occult sects and incendiaries should be arrested and paralyzed, end quote. And so the very way that they were talking about these revolutionary forces as occult sects, as being unholy, as being unnatural, you know, and how there needed to be a certain the what words is he using here? Common action, you know.
Yeah.
So all of these states within Europe are joining together against these unholy, these unnecessary, these crisis acting, these these anarchical groups of people that are revolting just to start another quarter century long war.
It's like they're talking about they're fighting the devil when they're really just talking about people who want to be recognized as people and having a voice in how they run things, which, to these days doesn't sound like a pretty wild idea. But I guess, that's right from the mouth of Satan if you ask people like Metternich back in that time. But
And then
yeah,
again, Tsar Alexander, he was also a young guy at the time. He was even younger than Metternich. By the time that the French Revolution took place, he was 10, and by the time of the Congress of Vienna, he was in his mid 30s. So again, his entire life was centered around the European reaction to French Revolution and French aggression afterwards. And so, even though he was a total asshole during the Congress of Vienna when it came to him wanting power in Central Europe, in his like Poland Act, it was after that time that he recognized that there needed to be common action against revolutionaries because as even though these liberals they wanted very reasonable things for themselves, the noble aristocracy, unless there was a really good reason for it, would not budge because of the fear which were in so many of these leaders' lives because the aggression and the revolution and the effects of liberal ideals were felt throughout their entire lives. They spent their entire lives from, in Alexander's case, since he was 10 years old, fearing revolution in his country. So when he eventually became ruler, he would be an iron fist against such rebellion.
exactly. And so what you have after the Congress of Vienna, we have all these countries coming together to fight the common enemy of liberalism. The common enemy of liberalism keeps peeking its head, and it keeps doing so for the next 20, 30 years. I mean, you have uprising in Spain and Portugal in 1820, Piedmont and Greece in 1821, Russia in 1825, some in 1830s. And what we have there is just what these agreements were agreeing upon, is that all these nations who had came together during Napoleon to stop this common threat of liberalism at the end of the day, they were coming together um, to work and to stop these revolutions and these revolts within, each other's states. Russia didn't really have much of a stance all the way over in, say, France or uh, Brussels, but they would be working together with these other countries in order to stop these revolts, in order to stop the flame of liberalism spreading to their own country. It was like they were acting outside of their own immediate interest, which would say, be expand their territory. Oh, we don't want France to be as powerful. Yeah, let them have a revolution. We don't want them to, fight us. But since the common enemy at the end of the day was liberalism, that same enemy could pop up within the borders of Russia. So every group they had a common interest of trying to stop this because again they were scared shitless of the idea of people rising up together to fight for rights. And so we had such extreme things as Austrian troops using against rebels in Italy, which is pretty wild. But again, we have countries acting out of their own self-interest, which is the basis for so many decisions, against this common enemy of liberalism.
And it wasn't like there weren't challenges to this authority at all. I mean, as Chad mentioned, there were revolts in Spain, Portugal, Greece, Russia, and really all throughout Europe. There was a revolution in France in July of 1830, which displaced the Bourbon monarchy, which was reestablished back in France post 1815, which was there during the time of the French Revolution when the French king was killed in the early 1790s. So the Bourbons they were pushed out of France during the Revolution, brought back in 1815, and then the people in 1830 in France they rejected that king and forced him to leave and brought a certain constitutional monarchy with this new guy Louis Philippe as king. And so, since it was still a monarchy, and there was an agreement that the people would be pacific to the idea of a constitutional monarchy. There wasn't too much revolt or counter-revolutionary action against that. But it wasn't like there weren't challenges to this conservative order, and those are just a few examples in Spain, Portugal, Greece, Russia, and France. Like there was constant effort required to make sure that there wasn't revolution. There were revolutions in the Vatican, in the Papal States of Italy. There were revolutions in Poland, modern day Poland. As we mentioned in the last episode, we said that Russia getting Poland as a trophy for its victory against Napoleon to show like a territory to make up for its losses during that war. It would be a double-edged sword because those people, the Polish people, they wanted their own state too. And during the time from 1815 all the way up to 1914, there would be continuous revolts against Russian occupation. And that's what we saw in the time, even before 1848, when the peacekeeping authority against liberalism was at its strongest. So you had constant threats to this regime, and they were suppressed very swiftly, these uprisings, but they did not exactly stop. And so, moving on with another quote from I believe this is the Germany, A Nation in Our Time. We are moving into Central Europe, of course, since the book is talking about German history, but we're kind of just like changing our point of view from the rulers to the ruled to see what it was like being suppressed and having your work and your ideas be suppressed and have your ideas be vilified and villainized. So, quote, impatient with what they saw, and they being young German liberal authors, as the suffocating stillness of the 1820s, and having little idea how much worse things could be, they romanticized violence and railed against an oppressive system and its main personification, the detested and dreaded Prince Metternich. It seemed to these young authors that hardly a letter went unread or a critical book not suppressed, especially in Austria, where every footman in a public house is a salaried spy, as Charles Saalfeld, an exiled Austrian author, put it. But measured by the standards of Russia or Spain at the time, censorship in the 1820s Germany was either haphazard or too sophisticated. Nor were the police omnipresent. Both Britain and France had larger forces than Austria, and Prussia's police was smaller still, end quote. And so in the place in Europe where arguably there was the least amount of censorship, there was still a lot of things being done to make sure that liberals did not get their word out. And we'll go into even further detail with further quotes going on just in this episode. But point that needs to be made, even in the first sentence of that quote, the young, German and Austrian authors at that time, the German and Austrian liberal authors at the time, these people were born at the very end or after the Napoleonic Wars. And so they never saw the violence that came from their ideas. They never saw the reason why these rulers were stopping and counter revolting against their liberal ideals. So there's two sides to this, but at the same time, and we'll see further on just how much repression there was against these ideas, because these ideas they were fought, and even though Austria and certain sections within Germany weren't even the worst censored, it was still so bad that people argued that measures against revolutionaries were too extreme. And this movement that took up during the 1815 until unification in 1871, the Young Germany movement, where they were inspired by liberal movements during the Napoleonic era. And so the it's kind of hard to argue and pick a side, because while the kings and emperors, they were arguing against rights for peoples, you could see kind of why they were doing it, because the very people that they're trying to round up in prison or kill for the sake of peace, are inspired by the liberal movements that brought about so much death.
Yeah.
So,
Change flip again back, on the liberal side of this. So here we are, born, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. They hadn't seen a lot of the war, as Khalil said, that had brought of wars so devastating that it brought European leaders to try to stop liberalism at such a high extent. But what you have here is you have your leaders, your people in power, stamping down your ideas, stamping down the things that you have basically just learned over there from France. The idea is that people could have individual rights, that a government might work for the people, that you might be part of the government. These are idea again, looking at them now in our current time in 2023, these seem like just normal. This seems like the standard. But this was a very, very, very new idea. One to the elites and those in power was extremely threatening to the effect that they would take such measures of censorship against them. But it was so new again that we had people in Germany, we had people all over the place who wanted to try this idea out. The only real example that we had that was kind of moving along at its paces was America, and that's all the way across the Atlantic. So those in Germany, those in basically Europe were wanting to try this new philosophy out, try out this new movement, try out this idea, this proposition, this way of living that would improve that they felt would improve their lives, in the long run. And in reality, going past all of this, it would. But at the context of the time now, all that these people were seeing were themselves being oppressed, not being listened to, being watched constantly. So we have another quote on the situation that these um, German partisans were kind of facing is that quote in Germany, the decline in artisanal wages, the deleterious effects of customs wars, rising peasant debt, and the high price of bread fueled a series of protests, particularly in the middle and northern of Germany. End quote. So Germany at the time was having a lot of problems. The people felt they were facing high prices. It was harder to live, cost of living. You've heard that before. And the leaders who traditionally you would trust to have your country's best interests in mind and your best interests in mind were not listening. There were problems, but the leaders weren't solving them. Prussia and Austria were refusing to concede on like these hardships on the partisans, on basically just the normal peasants throughout the nations and the countries. And again, these were facts on the grounds. People were hungry, wages were low, working conditions were shit. And so here we are as these young liberals seeing that the state of affairs sucks. And they have an idea with them, a new idea that might free them of this, the idea of a representative government, of free ideas, of rights, of responsibilities, even. Um, and all they get in response from the government, from people like Metternich, is that they are, as we saw them describing in some of those previous quotes, as basically like the devil, as foreign, as unholy. We saw these at they saw them incredibly negative, and so from these people on the ground, from these liberals, I think they have pretty good reason to be, starting to think of revolting or starting to think of, having some grievances, albeit they may not know the consequences of their actions, but um, they had a reason to believe that things sucked and they had a potential solution for it. And all they were getting was censorship and repression.
right. They were being seen as crisis actors, that they had no real reason for acting, and they just couldn't see the bigger picture. Um, so um, another quote from Germany, A Nation in Its Time by Helmut Walter Smith. Um, quote, to make matters worse, on Metternich's directive, so to keep in mind, Metternich has a lot of power and control during this time in Central Europe. The censors banned outright the works of young Germany authors and constricted the flow of books from foreign presses. Some regional German governments pursued the bans issued in 1834 with great vigor, others with less. Austria stood out, staunching the flow of new poetry, political newspapers, and radical pamphlets. Austria had already barred foreign students from attending its universities, and it had prohibited young Austrians from studying anywhere but in Austria itself. The policy poisoned the public sphere and embittered the young, who saw the Confederation, as the British envoy in Frankfurt observed, as being bent upon the total destruction of the liberties of Germany, end quote. So you see that these bans on what was being said, what was being thought, and these young Germany authors, many of them being born around the year 1810, 1805 at the very oldest, some of them a little younger even, they did not see the violence of the Napoleonic Wars. And if they heard of it, they thought it was being overstated. They thought that it wasn't worth fighting Napoleon and fighting those forces the way that they did, if they were going to live the way that they were at that time. So, so they thought that there should be an absence of peace, a restoration of war and conflict to bring about the freedom that they wanted. And so that's why, in response, in Austria, as is mentioned in the quote here, they wanted to have a complete restriction and control over the ideas entering the minds of their intellectual elite. And so for young Austrians and Germans and other ethnic groups, for those young people attending universities, they could not be taught anywhere else because who knows what those other places will teach them. There's a chance that it's probably going to be very similar because again, the conservative order was rather united at this time, but Austria did not even want to take the chance. They wanted to make sure that they had a control on what these people thought, and that they cannot be taught anywhere else. That no one other than an Austrian or no one that is not born within their territorial confines can be taught within their universities. And so they wanted to have a complete control over what was being taught, which damaged the perception of Metternich in the minds of these young people as being the detested and dreaded Prince Metternich. But and also, as you see from the British point of view, they say that it is that these policies seem to be bent on the total destruction of the liberties of Germany. And so that's the point of view of Britain, which, Britain wants to have a foreign policy that has very little interaction with events in Europe. They want to stay outside of it. They want to be in their splendid isolation as much as possible. And Britain, for compared to these other places in Europe at the time, since they are geographically separated as an island, but then also politically separated because of their splendid isolation policy, they had a much more liberal system, arguably, in where they had a constitutional monarchy. In 1832, they had the Great Reform Bill, which brought about suffrage for a larger group of the male population than before. There were certain laws that made it a better place to live. And that's why in 1848, with a lot of the chaos that took place around Europe, Britain didn't really suffer too much of it because of the rather liberal system that was already in place. And so, as compared with that, to get the British to get the British, what's the word, bias out of the way. Well, actually, no. Actually, you know what?
Yeah,
It's actually good that we have a British point of view here because Britain, can kind of be seen as the unbiased point of view looking at this and seeing that, oh my God, what they're doing here is insane. They're trying to destroy the freedom and liberties of these people. But of course, from Metternich's perspective, it seems completely justified.
yeah. What's interesting is that in this whole kind of episode up towards like as we get towards 1848 and beyond, is that Britain's kind of the outside actor. Like you said, they want to enjoy the splendid isolation of simply just ruling their colonies and letting Europe, stay stable, of course, but let them figure out their own issues. Let Europe solve its own fights. Sound familiar? But what was happening here within Europe, within Central Europe, specifically with Germany, was from the perspective of the new liberals, was their rights, their freedoms, their everything that they had fought for, they hadn't, but they believed that others had fought for were being taken away, were being squashed by people who just wanted to keep their power, people who wanted the world order to stay as it was and to let their lives continue to be as terrible as it was. And so we had, again, Britain is kind of, they want to and they are kind of sitting this one out. They're letting Metternich and people like those within continental Europe figure this situation out. Um, but within Europe, we have this clash, this growing clash, really, of the new liberals, the rising liberals throughout the country, and the older powers trying to keep the grander sense of peace. Um, and so, again, it's this growing clash that's going to become a lot more important when we get to 1848, and we'll get that later down the line. Um, but again, we'll have here's another quote from another one on the liberals' perspective. Would be George Buchner. He's 21 years old. He was born in 1813. So again, right at the end of the Napoleonic age, is the author of, excuse my American, but Der Heisig Landboat. And so again, it's from our book, a quote from our book. So deeply frustrated by the lack of progress in the revolutions of the 1830s and the series of revolts before 1848. And despite him only being 17 at the time, um, repression of the German states in the middle of Europe and by other conservative forces in Iberia, Britain, and Russia inspired a very young class of revolutionaries seeking to implement the dreams and the ideals of the French revolutionaries of the previous generation. The reactionary powers at play at the time were hated by these young men, and in spite of incessant surveillance and censoring, under the threat of prison, execution, and torture, um, quote, in 1838, he penned Der Heißlenboden, a pamphlet proclaiming the taxation as a blood tithe, the new constitution's empty straw, law and property of the superfluous classes, and the government the father of lies. Earnest and bitter, full of statistics and yet rhetorically powerful, the High Sealand Bolton threatened that whoever lifts the sword against the people shall be slain by the sword of the people, end quote. This is 219 in our book. So here we have again a starting to become powerful, a starting to become vocal and adamant reactionary or revolutionary liberal youth that's springing up in Europe that's really is being bred the by the repression of the Central European of the conservative powers. You stamp down on people for so long, you restrict all their ideas, their freedom, no wonder they're going to hate you. And so when conditions get worse and the people are facing things like surveillance, censorship, the threat of prison, torture, even execution, death, yeah, people are not going to be on your side and they're going to be looking for new ideas that could make their life better. And when they have the recent example of France and before Napoleon, the success of that, you see a potential out of it. You see one way that could push you and people of Europe towards, you know, um, a better future. And so, an editor of his pamphlet, a friendly pastor, Frederick Ludwig of Wieding, was thrown into prison and tortured so brutally that he committed suicide. Other friends of his were killed, likely tortured as well, so much so that Buchner himself, while he escaped, was, quote, stricken by guilt and traumatized by the specter of a slow, silent death in prison, end quote. So, again, under this entire threat of torture, death, killing, disappearing, Buchner himself, he wasn't even caught. He never died. He didn't he wasn't tortured, wasn't stabbed, he wasn't put in court, nothing. He just saw his friends get like their shit rocked. And he was that scared from the other revolution of those powers that it it sucked the life out of him. Bro quit. That's how repressive these forces that basically kids, teenagers, young adults at this time were threatened and killed and imprisoned so brutally that, I mean, revolutionaries were giving up on the fight and not even getting killed themselves.
Right. I mean, I can't imagine being as young as I am, advocating for certain freedoms and being a public protester. I know a lot of people myself, Chad and I are both in the Bay, and the Bay is a kind of known for having a certain liberal revolutionary mindset. I know a lot of people in Berkeley, Oakland, and San Francisco. I'm from Oakland myself, and these are places, if you know anything about the Bay, that are very liberal. They are places and where if there's something going on in the country or even in the world, there's probably going to be a protest about it. And so I can't imagine those people that I know, as young as I am at 18, going to those protests, getting caught, being thrown into prison and tortured so brutally that they commit suicide, and then me being friends of these people who might have given them these ideas become so scared of what might happen to me that even at my young age of 21, and I'm only 18, but if I'm Buchner and I'm 21, not too much older than myself, writing all these works, and writing all these pamphlets, trying to mobilize the thoughts of the people, that I feel as if my life is over because the people that I knew, they had these things happening to them, and it was soon enough
Bro, they're dead.
that he was soon enough that it was going to happen to him. That he really had the life sucked out of him. That his revolutionary mindset and the energy of a young person was just wiped out by the savagery of the counter-revolutionary forces. But it wasn't like he couldn't back up his points with facts. He had a decent point, and that's really the complication of this time period, because the revolutionary people at the time, they had a reason for advocating for what they advocated for, but the peacekeeping authority, they also had a good reason for doing so, because a lot of these people that were fighting these revolts, they experienced the savagery of the French Revolution. And that's why even in the revolutions of 1848, which we'll get to later, a lot of the army generals and the commanders that would lead forces against rebels and against revolutionaries in all corners of Europe, they were actually a lot older. There is a man, Radetzky, that would be known for kind of ending the Italian unification movement before it even started in 1848 until it would be restarted a decade or so after, that called the Risorgimento. But he was 81, during
Hmm.
1848, and that's just an example. And we'll go into the further details of it later. But he was 81, leading troops against these nationalists, these liberal people that wanted
Against
to get
kids.
rid.
They're
It's
basically
kids,
kids.
really, and because he's so old, and because he can look back at the French Revolution and all the danger that brought and all the war that came after that, he, with all the memories of those events, all came back to him so much so that when he faced battle with these nationalists and with these liberals and with these people that wanted to throw away the power of the king and throw away the power of the emperor, the nobles, and whatever, the kings and queens, you know, that he would come in with a vengeance, because again, there are reasons for why each one of these powers, like the reactionary forces of the liberals, and the conservative forces, are doing what they're doing. But with Buchner, at least he could back up his points with facts, because as Helmut Walter Smith puts, it was earnest and bitter, full of statistics and yet rhetorically powerful. And so it wasn't like he was just bullshitting. He gave reasons for why he thought what he thought. It was full of statistics. He was telling the truth, and that's why it was seen as a threat. And so throughout Europe, you would have constant threats to the peace, even in Britain, and where it's seen as the most liberal and the most geographically and politically separated from the chaos of Europe. You had an event called Peterloo, in where thousands of workers, I think even tens of thousands of workers, revolted against working conditions in Manchester. And then the British cavalry and the British army came in, and they basically treated the mob as if they were an army, like a counter, like an enemy army, and nearly 1,000 people died that day. And then you had other events all throughout Europe. You had revolutionary action in Moldavia, which is modern day Moldova. You have action in Spain. You have action in Sicily and Naples, southern Italy. You have actions in Piedmont, northern Italy. You have actions in Serbia, Poland, Netherlands, Russia, France, Portugal, and this is really all throughout in every corner of Europe, damn near. And so this is, and they all have their own different reasons for it. Most of them wanted abolition of secret police, which were very active at the time. And then you had a lot of different liberal appeals, like the abolition of monarchy and other freedoms of speech and assembly. That they were not being afforded, but still at this time, counter-revolutionary forces and conservative forces were strong enough to stop those.
Yeah. And so what you had here again was that we had revolution, revolt, 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 and that all of these lands, all of these people who felt they're being clenched, being squashed, being silenced, were being opposed by these forces and these generals and these kings who saw them again as a threat to the peace, a threat to the peace of mankind, or at least the continent. And so basically two extremely opposed views continuing and continuing to fight each other in various levels of intensity all the way up to where we would get into 1848. But so you had an increasingly kind of agitated, I would say, state of Europe, where another quote by Hobsbawm would describe it as, quote, kings and statesmen were neither wiser nor more pacific, you know, for peace, than they were before, but they were unquestionably more frightened, end quote. And so we had, a certain level of peace in that nations weren't, states weren't fighting each other. We didn't have, wasn't another Napoleon who would ravish all across the continent. But, there was a peace that somewhat existed throughout Europe because of the fears of the leaders. Um, the fears of those leaders trying to stop the reignition of another great power conflict. And again, a lot of this boiled down to that fear of liberalism and the fear that in these nations, a group could start up and start power and recklessly, as they thought liberals would do, just simply start wars and start another basically world war before they had the word for it. But it was a level of peace. Um, Again, various ways to describe it, but it was a level of peace. And so in the background, we had we had the British Empire kind of existing and somewhat being, some level of fine with the existence of this kind of this conflict throughout Central Europe because it was able to keep its kind of independence throughout what's it called? Throughout Europe, throughout basically the world, because at this time, Britain was able to keep its colonies, you know, throughout 1815, and I'll bring up a map of this. Britain had colonies throughout the world, and this is kind of what it was trying to focus the most on. It had India, had Canada, Jamaica, Honduras, Guyana, Cape Colonies, Australia. It had these places around the world. And so, in this grand circumstance where, in the fight of liberalisms and conservatives and all this kind of thing, what Britain really just wanted to do was just kind of keep what it has and keep growing. And it did. This is a map of the British Empire by 1914, before the start of World War One. And so the British Empire, what it wanted to do was keep its colonies and stay out of that BS that Europe was trying to do. And to a certain extent, it kind of was able to. So from its perspective, from the perspective of Britain, that conflict or low level conflict at the time at least was beneficial at least as long as those states did not rise up and gain power. And so hence you had the necessity of the balance of power in Europe, and that these states can't start another war where Britain would have to get dragged into. And so, as long as they didn't do that, Britain can conquer the world.
Right. So, as we can see here, there is a while Europe has these censorship laws, and while there is this fight over what freedoms the average person should get and what freedoms peasants should get, should there be an abolition of serfdom, and should there be more freedom of the press, freedom of speech and association? Is that to be respected and afforded to these people? Would kings and emperors be abolished, or would there just be constitutions to limit their power, kind of like in Britain? Would there be parliaments? Would there be elected, or would they be appointed by the king or emperor? Though these were arguments that were taking place throughout Europe, But while these arguments are being had, but at the same time, while the the peacekeeping authority and while the Holy Alliance was strong enough to stop too much liberal action, from spilling over into eventual great power conflict, Britain was able to grow and grow and grow and grow. And it's not like by 1848, Britain just stopped gaining colonies. They continued to gain them until World War I, and actually, believe it or not, after. But the difference of the peacekeeping angle of British power, there was a paradigm shift from 1848 onward, and then by 1914 it was gone because you had World War I. You can't exactly say the Pax Britannia that continued. The Pax Britannia, which means peace, continued from 1914 onward because you had the two biggest wars in human history. So after 1848, and we'll go about this, later on with our episode on the fall of the British Empire later on, but it took more effort, it took more threats and alliances for Britain to keep to keep the peace between great powers in Europe. And it was a different foreign policy that was different than splendid isolation. It required a bit more involvement and a bit more threats to certain powers that wanted to go beyond their afforded balance of power, to looking at their own national interests. And it took a certain type of foreign policy for Britain to do that while also keeping peace in the continent. So that's for later on. The next episode we're going to have is on the international model, international law, and how there's certain peacekeeping authority behind modern institutions like the UN, NATO, and even America itself. And so, Chad, if there's anything else you want to say.
I think that's about it. Summed it up pretty well.
All right. Well, without a further ado, I'm Khalil,
I'm Chad.
and we are the Marshals of Truth.
We'll see you in the next one.